Hello everybody and welcome. Welcome to this month's RELO Bangkok webinar. Thanks to the US Department of State for making another one of these possible. My name is Katie Wood. I am a teacher trainer with AUA Thailand, and today I'm very happy to be your presenter on the topic of keeping things communicative with large classes. So our aim today is to think about what is a large class? What do we mean? What's challenging about teaching large classes? And then from those challenges, thinking about some strategies, some takeaway ideas so that we can keep large classes as communicative as possible. And we're also, lastly, going to look at what are the possible benefits of having a large class. Now, today we are going to make use of the chat box. So can I just ask everybody to change their setting, click on all panelists and participants, so that if you send any messages, everybody can see what you're saying. And while you do that, can you write a little hello into the chat box so I know that you're here and you can hear me, and also maybe where you are watching from, where you're joining us from. Okay, we've got Manali from India here, wonderful. And Eve, nice to see you, Eve. So far, India and Thailand. And we've got May from Myanmar. Very nice. We've got a mixture of places today. And Wirani from Bangkok. Good. Well, welcome to everybody. So let's get started. All right. So that first question, how large is large? So we talk about large classes, but is there a clear definition of what a large class is? So think for a moment and then type in a number to the chat box. For you, if you said, oh, my class is large, around about how many students are you talking about for you personally? And then we can look at each other's answers and see what the range of opinions is. Okay, some ideas coming in. There's no wrong or right answer here. Okay, interesting. So far we've got 30 plus, 45, 50 plus. Anybody got anything similar or different? 60 plus, wow, yeah. And another idea of 50. Great. Okay. So that's interesting, isn't it? A lot of you are around about the same idea. This could be cultural as well. It could depend where you're teaching and what kind of context. So typically a private language school might think that sort of 25 was a large class. Whereas if you're used to teaching in a government school, in some countries, a typical number might be 50 or 60. So the key thing here is really that it doesn't matter what whether there's an official agreement about what is a large class. The point is, if we think it's a large class for us, then we maybe will need to think about how we might do things differently to what we consider is not a large class. So we might think that there are some challenges to some of these numbers. So again, another question for you. You don't need to type this time, just have a think. What do you think are the main things that you feel, either in your experience or what you think might be true, about working with a large class? Okay, so what are the things that you think, Okay. So I'm sure some of you are thinking of some ideas there, or maybe some past experiences of things that have been challenging for you. I'm going to show you some of my ideas and my experiences here. As you watch, see if they're the same or different to what you came up with. Okay, so there's our teacher thinking, 50 students. So one thing that sometimes comes up is, with 50 students or with 30 students or with this large class, there's going to be more variety in terms of ability, in terms of interests, in terms of learning preferences and the way students like to do things. So how do I deal with that? Another frequent question is, how can I be interactive? Okay, how can I do interactive tasks when there are so many students? It's going to be chaos. I won't be able to manage it. And related to that, this interaction idea, group work. How does group work with a lot of students? And then, because there are more, how can I keep everybody interested? How can I keep the class motivated? And often something which teachers think about is, right, I'm trying to do this activity. It's a little bit complicated. How can I make sure everybody understands? Right? If somebody doesn't understand in a class of 10 or 15, maybe it's easier for the teacher to spot. But if you've got a class of 40 or even bigger, okay, how can I be sure everybody knows what to do? And the last one that often comes up, how am I going to monitor? How will I, even if I manage to set this activity up, how am I going to make sure that students are doing what I want? How am I going to see what language they're using? How am I going to see if they're making progress? So lots of questions. Let's see what you think. We'll do a little poll. And in that poll, I'd like you to choose 2 things from that list there. At the end of the session, we'll have questions. So maybe you've got something that I haven't come up with. But from those questions I've just presented, what are the 2 biggest or 2 most important for you? So is it, how can I do interactive tasks? Too many, it'll be chaos. Is it different abilities, interests, learning preferences? Is it about how to do group work, particularly if you're in a classroom where the chairs don't move? How can I keep students interested? So let's see. Here comes the poll. Choose 2. And again, there's no right or wrong answer here. This is just, what do you think? What would you be most concerned about, most worried about? Okay, thank you to those that have voted so far. So far, we're talking about just being interactive in general and keeping interest, keeping motivation. Okay. Very short time if you'd like to vote and you haven't. Okay. So there we go. The biggest one, just how do I keep my lesson interactive and how do I keep students motivated? Okay, well, we're going to look at those things. So hopefully we'll take away some strategies. And we'll concentrate more on the ones that are more important to you. So let's look at that first one then that got the most votes. How can I do interactive tasks? It's going to be chaos. And this is very clearly linked, I think, to classroom management issues. Maybe there's a feeling that it's going to be chaos because I won't be able to make everybody understand what I want from them. So what are some strategies? Okay, so this may seem like a very obvious one, but rules and routines. So rules, I think an important point here is agreed rules. So maybe there is some room for things that students will agree to do and things that the teacher will agree to do. And also the benefits of having routines. Okay, so for example, with a large class, one of the routines that can be established is that as soon as students come into the classroom, they know that there will be a task waiting for them, a sort of straight into it task that they can start and they get on with before the teacher starts giving instructions to any following activities. So that might be, I go to my desk and it says, look at the picture on the slide, write down 3 things you see. Something very simple, but something that the students will come, get their bags out. Okay, I've got something to get straight into. And the other thing we should say about these rules and routines is that they will take time. So a routine, by definition, is something we do repeatedly. And once students know how certain things work, the first time you do them, maybe they're not going to be very efficient or effective. Maybe there will be a little bit of chaos or disorganization. But we have 2 choices. We can either give up and never try again and have a very teacher-centered, possibly very boring lesson, or we can try it again and we can remind students about last time, and each time we do something, they get better, they get quicker at it. Okay, what else? So when we want students to work together, and this also links to the things we're going to talk about with group work, if students work in a group, nominating roles within those groups can be very effective. So for example, we might have a student who is responsible for giving out any handouts, which is going to be a lot quicker than the teacher trying to go around and give out handouts to 50 students. We might have somebody in the group who is the secretary kind of idea, who needs to write down what the students have discussed and be ready to report to the class. It might be that we have a student who is going to be the answer checker, and the teacher gives an answer key to that student. So it's bringing some responsibility for how interactive tasks work to the students themselves. And of course, each lesson, those roles can be changed so that the secretary one lesson next week is the answer checker, for example. Or perhaps the student whose job it is to remind everybody to try and speak English. The other important thing, which I have personally learned through experience, is that if we as the teacher try and compete with noise, we are not going to win. There's one of us and there's a lot of them. If we're going to, we make our voices louder and louder, then we want to stop an activity, for example. So we raise our voice. The students don't really hear, so they raise their voices. And before you know it, all we've done is increase the noise level in the classroom. So I have seen some really effective examples of this in large classrooms in China, where the teacher will have a signal which goes back to this idea of agreed rules, agreed routines. So in one class I watched, the teacher would flick the lights on and off, and the class knew when that happened. Oh, okay, right, we're stopping. I've seen some very fun, engaging and effective ways of using callbacks. So this is where the teacher might say something like macaroni, and the whole class, when they hear the word macaroni, has to repeat cheese. Okay, so you use a phrase and you say half of it, and the students must give you a kind of pre-arranged, pre-known response. So it could be a question and answer. It might be, are we ready? And the students call out, yes, we are. And once one hears this and the others hear it, it kind of snowballs. So this can be a very effective way of getting everybody's attention rather than trying to shout. It could be the simplest one is you put your hand up, and as each student sees you with your hand up, they must join and put their hands up. And very quickly, this will spread around the classroom. Everybody's quiet. Everybody's got their hand up. I think also it's just key, even more key, that we give instructions that are clear. One of the biggest things that happens is that we as teachers maybe don't give the clearest instructions, and so then our class sort of, oh, what does she want us to do? And then they start talking and they're not listening to the next instruction, and then maybe it becomes difficult again for the teacher to get their attention. So thinking about our instructions very carefully before the lesson is going to be really, really important. And also giving them stage by stage. So, for example, if we want the class to do two things, but we only want them to do the first thing now, and we want them to do the second thing after. If we tell them both things to begin with, usually they forget the second thing, and then we have to repeat it and maybe stop them and re-explain. So a very good idea, tell them what you want them to do now, get them to do it, stop them, tell them what you want them to do next. And supporting instructions with visuals is so, so important in the classroom, particularly when you've got a large group, because it's much easier for students not to hear us when there's a lot of kind of moving or noise or whispering. So showing them as well as telling them. Okay, so ICQs. Let's have a look in the chat box. So if you know what an ICQ is, type it into the chat box. Let's see if anybody is familiar with this technique. So when we're giving instructions, we could ask an ICQ. Okay. So I think maybe some of you will know this when I tell you. So an ICQ is an instruction checking question. Yes, there we go. Thank you, Kitty. And so when we've given an instruction, we can quickly check before we move on. Okay, have they got this? So a not very good instruction checking question is, do you understand? Right, because your students are probably going to, yeah, yes, but maybe they don't. So we think about what it is that we want students to do that they might confuse, and then we ask a question to check that they've understood. For example, if I want my students to make some notes, and then they're going to use those notes to talk to their partner, but I don't want them to write full sentences, that is something that once I've told them, make some notes about your ideas on this topic. Do you need to write a full sentence? And so we ask the students, and then we will get the answer back and we'll know, did they understand what I want? Okay. Or if I'm using my groups and maybe I want them to talk together, I could think back to my roles that I've established, and I might say, okay, are we ready? Note takers, put your hand up in the group, and then visually, immediately, I can see, is everybody listening to me? Are the note takers ready? So that's the first thing we can do to make sure students are able to do these interactive activities, is be very clear about how they're going to do them and what we want them to do. Okay, so again, let's imagine now that I have got them started on an interactive activity. Maybe they're having a discussion in groups of 3 or 4, or maybe even with their partner. How can I monitor? So this is a challenge, isn't it? What we might want to think about is varying the way we monitor across the length of our lesson. So, for example, if I'm going to have maybe 3 or 4 parts of my lesson where students are going to work together, I might decide, okay, I will monitor closely these 3 groups in the first 5 or 6 minute activity. And then a little bit later in the class, when I do that second activity, speaking task, they're working together, I will monitor groups 4, 7, and 8 more closely. So I don't ignore the class as a whole, but I'm going to spend a little bit more time focusing on a certain number of groups during this activity, and then a certain number of groups during the next activity. And that means that I get a better idea of how students are doing, what their needs are, what difficulties they're having, than if I'm trying to go around the whole class for the whole time. So this is not exactly monitoring, but it's sort of post-task monitoring, if you like. So one of the reasons that we monitor is to kind of find out whether students found this easy or difficult, whether they enjoyed it. And I might not be able to find that out from every individual student if I've got 50 students. So we can use things like exit tickets, some kind of student evaluation tool. So we might have a little piece of paper that we give each student that they have to tick a box or write down what they thought about something, and they give it to us before they leave the lesson. And then we can look at that and we can get quite good feedback on how things went from their perspective. Okay, the other way to sort of see how well students are doing with something is, so we can monitor, we can hear as they're doing it, and we can also include some activities where they have to actually produce something visible. So for example, this might be a poster. Okay. Then we have this thing to look at and see, oh, what's in here? What information have they got? What language on this poster are they using well? Are they able to use the vocabulary that I've been teaching? So I can do my monitoring while they're doing it, but then I also have something at the end that I can take away and look at. Okay, but we are going to want to, at some point in the lesson, move about just to see, or we might have a student kind of get our attention. So we need to just make sure there is a clear route around the classroom. It sounds like a very obvious thing, but think about, right, if I need to get to this point in the classroom, how am I going to do that? Is there a route? Am I able to get to most of my classroom? Even if I can't get right next to every single student, can I get close enough to answer their question or to see how they're doing? And then finally, I think this is quite a simple thing, but quite an important thing. Typically, in a large classroom, we have rows of students. And very often, students will sit in the same place every single lesson. So that means there is a tendency, it's more common for the teacher to notice what is going on with the first few rows, because it's easier to get eye contact with them. The teacher can see physically what's going on, whereas at the back, maybe not. So if we occasionally, if we're going to give instructions for something, right, and we don't need to be at the board, we can move. If our classroom is kind of a square, instead of always being here, we might go and elicit feedback from this way and point this way. So people have to turn a little bit, but these people here, or the people at the back, become the front, and they're therefore kept on their toes and more engaged than if they're constantly looking 10 rows ahead to see the teacher. All right. How can I keep students interested and motivated? So there will be a lot of overlap between these things, But one of the most interesting things about this is that we find doing communicative activities more challenging with large groups. And so sometimes we shy away from it. But actually that in itself can create very demotivated students who then don't pay attention in class and maybe become even more demotivated. So, you know, all of this stuff about making the class interactive as much as possible will help to keep students actively involved. And if we think about the times when students are most likely to become a bit disinterested or we lose attention, it's when the teacher is talking for a longer period of time. So that might be in instruction, and it might be particularly in feedback. Okay, those are kind of key points in the lesson that can go on too long sometimes. So for instructions, we need to keep them clear and short, and our students can get to do the activity as soon as possible. And with feedback, we might think about varying it. We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so here's something about feedback. We might have the class, they might have done something, and now we want to check their answers. And one technique that we can use is to nominate. Oh, what did you say? Oh, okay. Now, very often, if this goes on too long, students kind of think, oh, she's not talking to me. I don't have to pay close attention to this bit unless, you know, So a few things here. We want students to listen to each other, not just the teacher. So for example, if I've asked a student over here, what did your group agree? Tell us one thing that you decided in this task, and the student tells us. I might ask the next student that I nominate randomly, okay, did you say the same thing? Do you agree with that student's comment? And this kind of takes the focus away from just the line of interaction going teacher, one student here, teacher, one student over there. Instead, we get them understanding that they need to pay attention to each other. And also by nominating randomly, we kind of keep students guessing a little bit that, oh, it could be me. I better pay attention because maybe I'm going to be asked a question in a minute. Okay, something else that creates greater interaction is peer learning. So always taking every opportunity to get students to check together, to help each other. There are many reasons why this can be motivating. If I'm a weaker student, I don't want to necessarily give my answer to the teacher if I'm not confident about it. If I've checked it with somebody else, maybe they've helped me, I'm more likely to be confident about it. For the stronger students, it's very motivating to be able to help somebody else and to be, oh, I knew that. And just generally, it increases the amount of communication in the lesson without a huge amount of input from the teacher. So whenever possible, pair checking or small group checking. We've talked about this already. Get feedback from students. They're likely to be much more engaged in the activities you do within your lesson if they feel they have some ownership of it, that the teacher is listening to what they say. And finally, I think activities that mean each student has something to contribute. So again, this might be relating back to the roles. Okay, so each student has something different to do. It might be things like giving them small projects to do together, where one student is responsible for doing the visual stuff. Another student is responsible, or another two students are responsible for writing out the text of what the presenter will say. Another two students might work together to choose the visuals for a presentation, and then they come together. So they have to work together to create this one thing, but each person is important, is needed. the whole thing cannot be created without each student in the group. This can be very motivating. Okay, so we have already talked quite a bit about group work and how we can do it. But I think one of the problems is the physical classroom, when teachers are worried about being able to do a communicative activity. And I think for many teachers, they feel like it's not a communicative activity if students can't get up and move around. So, of course, that is very nice. It's a very motivating and kind of energizing thing if students don't just sit in the same seat for the whole of the lesson. But it might not be possible. You might physically not have the room to have 50 people moving around quite so much. We might also have this issue with my chairs don't move, so I can't do activities where students work with different students. Well, we have a few possible ways around this. So pretty much any situation we're in the class, students can work in pairs. Okay, I'm sitting here, I can work with this person sometimes, and I can work with this person sometimes. Yeah. So if we can give clear instructions to that and think about maybe giving numbers to students, so 1 and 2 work together, we can say 1 and 2, 2 and 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and that can go down the rows, work with your partner. And then the next time it would be the other student, so 2 and 3 would work together, for example, or 1, 2 and 3 across a row. But also, of course, without too much of a problem, they can turn around and work with the person behind them or in front of them. So already we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different people that I can work with as a student, and I haven't had to move my chair. What else? Well, of course, we can do exactly the same, but with pairs. So my partner and I can work with the 2 students in front of us or the 2 students behind us. Okay? Or if we're in a 3, which is doable, 3 people, we can still speak to each other effectively. And then we can work with the 3 in front of us to make a 6, or we could work with the 3 behind us to make a 6. So sometimes we just have to adapt a little bit. But we've already got many different possibilities for interaction. And going back to motivation and keeping students engaged, variety is a way to keep students engaged because they don't always have to talk to the same person. Okay, one other thing that you might be able to do to give a bit more variety is if you've got rows of students, okay, a bit of fun, takes a little bit of time, but you can make everybody stand up and go 1 seat to your right. So this means that the person at the end of the row will have to get up and come to the far left of the row. And then again, we've got all of the possible interaction patterns we just talked about, but we'll have changed it slightly by who is now next to each other. And also a little bit of movement wakes everybody up without it having to, be a really big everybody out of their seats. Okay, let's move on to our final question that we had about challenges. How do I deal with different abilities, different interests, different learning preferences? This student is good at this, but not so good at this. This student likes this, but this student doesn't. I mean, we have those in any classroom, don't we? But perhaps when we've got more students, we feel like there's a greater variety of differences that we need to manage. So what can we do? So we've talked about this a little bit already, but vary the roles that students are given. So don't always give the same people the same things to do. Change things up a little bit. If we're thinking about different abilities, you can have an agreed task for early finishers. So in a similar way to how we talked about having this quick start task, where students know they will come in and the first thing they need to do is go to the wall and take this handout, or go to their desk and find out what they need to do, or there will be an activity on the projector as soon as they come into the classroom that they can get on with. So we can have this similar routine of, okay, if you finish early, this is the place you go, this is what you do. For example, a place in the classroom where students can come and get the second handout, or the extra activity. It's often said that the devil makes work for idle hands, meaning when students have done something and they're finished, they're much more likely to be a possible problem for us, because then they get bored and what can I do? Maybe I can interfere with my partner's work, or maybe I'm going to go on my phone. So if we give them something interesting to do and they know, that can be seen as a, oh, I achieved this, I got to do the extra activity. Finally, which again does kind of relate to these roles, but appoint a group teacher or ask someone who feels confident. Okay, so if we've got the weaker student, or if we've got a stronger student, when we're doing, particularly let's say we're doing a grammar task, we could ask, okay, if you feel like you're okay with this, okay, put your hand up, right, you're going to be the group teacher today. Okay, I think asking is quite a nice thing to do, allowing the students to express when they find something a bit more difficult or when they feel okay about something. So, excuse me, so a lot of the stuff that we've talked about previously relates to this as well, variety, okay, because then I know as a student, we don't always have to do lots and lots of gap filling because I really don't find that interesting. So even if there's a bit of that in the lesson, I know that somewhere in the lesson, there's going to be something that I do really enjoy. So that could be, there's a mixture of things, a mixture of speaking tasks, a mixture of writing tasks, a mixture of activities maybe where we've got to, as a group, we might have 5 words and 5 pictures and we've got to move them around the table if you have that kind of setup. That will be a kinesthetic kind of task. And we want to make constant use of visuals if we can, because then, if I like doing things this way, at least some of the time, the thing that is most interesting, most appealing, easier for me is in the lesson. All right, so that's a few suggestions for each of those possible challenges. And there are a few challenges. Let's see if we can think, though, about anything which is actually a bit more positive about teaching a large class. Oh, sorry, I forgot one. Give students choices where possible. Right? So if, for example, we are taking the advice of that was mentioned earlier about getting students to actually produce something physically, like a poster or a presentation, something like that. Maybe they've done a reading task, right? And we want to give them something after the reading where they use their productive skills. So we might tell them, instead of, right, everybody must make a poster, we might give them 3 choices. And we might let them choose within their group which one they want to do. You can make a poster, you can do a presentation, okay? Or you can write a paragraph kind of idea. So again, it links to this varying learning preferences. And also, the more ownership students have over a lesson, the more they feel like the lesson is theirs, not just something which they have to sit through and is kind of pushed onto them, the more likely they are to be motivated, to be active, and to learn more. All right, so sorry, let's go back then to the positives. Good things about large classes. So let's go back to the chat box here with this one. Have a think. Is there anything you've experienced or you can imagine? Actually, you know, that's quite good. When you have a lot of students, this is a positive or that's a positive. If you have an idea, type it in the chat box and let's see if we have similar or different ideas. Okay. So some nice ideas coming through in the chat box. Yes, Kitty is saying we have lots of different ideas. Wirani, thank you. Yes, the group work. There's more possibility maybe for group work actually, if we have more students. Yeah. Okay, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think this is in some ways a bit more difficult for us because we tend to see a big class as a bigger challenge, which in lots of ways it is. But okay, let's have a look at some positives. Variety is coming from the chat box. All right, great. So let's see if we have the same positives. So one thing that I think is interesting, when you've got a big class, for students, especially when they're working in groups, it can be much less intimidating. And what I mean by that is they might feel a lot less self-conscious because when you're working with a small class, the teacher can hear everything everybody says a lot of the time, and students can often be a lot quieter because they're worried about having the teacher hear their mistakes, or they're worried about the teacher noticing that they don't really understand something. Whereas when you've got these group work scenarios going on where they might feel a little bit more hidden, sometimes you will find that students are more willing to tell their peers in the group, I don't understand this, okay, or to work on fluency because they're not as worried about being heard by the teacher. So there's this sense of safety and security in a bigger number. Okay, what do we have next? So this is something a lot of you picked up in the chat box and said, yeah, with more students come more ideas, more points of view, more imagination, more variety of things. Sometimes we can be so surprised by the things that students come out with. And of course, if there are more of them, we have more ideas to reflect back on and to share with the group as a whole, which can be very positive. Okay, we've got more people to work with. This is a little bit relating to the fact where you can work with the person in front, the person behind, and if you're able, you can swap people from group to group around the classroom. So again, it comes to more variety. They might find out things that are interesting and they get to know the people in a larger class. There are more people to get to know. They can make more friends, possibly. And they get to hear different levels of student ability. You know, so they can work with a stronger student, they can work with a student who's at the same level as them, they can work with a weaker student. My final main one is that there's a very big potential in a larger class for students to develop more autonomy. What do I mean by that? There's a bigger chance for them to become responsible, more responsible for their own learning, because they will have to, you know. It's not physically possible for the teacher to be on hand all the time for each individual student. So this is kind of two-sided. From the teacher's point of view, it's very important to bring things into the classroom that encourage autonomy and independence in their learners. Things like the choose which thing you want to do. Things like working out meaning from context, which the teacher can then check as a whole class. But the work can be done by the students themselves. And often students respond quite well to this idea that, okay, we're getting on and doing things ourselves here. And I'm learning to be responsible for my own learning, which is a very kind of an important life skill as well. So we can gradually, and I mean gradually, move our students from this dependence on the teacher to becoming more dependent on themselves. Okay, so let's have a little look at what comes next. You might have some more ideas and some questions out of this, so hopefully we'll have time to look at those in a moment. Okay, I think the other thing that we can think about as teachers is the kind of task types that work well with larger classes. So again, if you'd like to, you can type in the chat box or you can just have a think. But what kinds of activities do you feel work particularly well with a large class? And here I'm trying to think about communicative activities, right? Because we already know that it feels easier to do kind of individual written activities. But what we're talking about here is what will work that's more communicative, that's group work. What kind of group activities do I think will be doable, effective when I've got 30, 40, 50 students? So if you have an idea, type it in the chat box. If not, maybe just think, is there something you tried to do with a big class that worked well? Is there something you tried to do with a big class that didn't really work as well as you would have liked? Just 30 seconds again to maybe have a think. Okay, so I'm going to share with you some things that I have found work well with larger classes. Great, we've got, May has said information gap activity. Yes, there's no reason why an information gap activity can't work well in a big class. So for example, I have some information about what somebody did yesterday. You have some information. We have to find the differences by communicating with our partner. Information gap activity. There's no reason that should work less effectively with 40 than it does with 20. It might take a little bit longer to set up, okay, but the activity is not limited by the number of students that are taking part. Very nice idea. Okay, let's have a look at a few more. Okay, something that I've found has worked well, particularly with teenagers actually, is board games. So even as we've said before, with our seats that don't move, these are possible. So a board game might be something like, I've got to roll the dice and move 5 squares, and when I land on this square, I need to answer a question or I need to talk for 1 minute. So I can play this with my partner as a team against another partner with a team. Okay, so a few things about that activity are quite nice. It tends to be motivating because most students, particularly at teenage years, like a little bit of friendly competition, and you're trying to win. Okay, and also because it's seen as fun, even if it's actually something that you've designed to get them to practice a particular grammar point, because it's in board game format, it tends to be more motivating. Another thing, going back to student autonomy, okay, once you've played board games in groups, before, and students know what they are and know how they work, you can actually have an activity where this group needs to make this kind of board game, give them a template, give them an example, or maybe you used one last lesson and then this lesson they've got to make their own. So that is also going back to that idea of making sure that when you've got a big class and you're doing when you're doing group work, you include things where they have to physically produce something. Okay, it can be motivating, and it also gives you evidence. You can look around and see without too much difficulty who's actually got something created. And of course, after they've used them, you can take them in. Okay, they could create one and then they could swap it with another group. And they could do that 2 or 3 times. So lots of autonomy, lots of motivation. And because they could play it in groups of sort of 4, for example, or maybe even 6, you don't have to create hundreds and hundreds of handouts. And again, if they're making it themselves, you definitely don't have to. They need paper and they need something to write with. That's it. So I think actually that's something we haven't mentioned, but it's quite an important thing. Thinking about low resource activities, because probably we don't want to spend hours photocopying 50 different bits of paper 3 times in a lesson. So wherever you can, do something which the students create or which requires minimal copying, then it's going to help and make that large class more manageable for us. Very simple activity, can be used in any size class. Think, pair, share. All right. So, for example, the task that they do when they first come in. If, just for example, you were going to be doing some work on food vocabulary, on your board could be think. What did you eat yesterday? Okay, so students come in, they see that and they have to think. Maybe they've got to write it down. Okay, once everybody's in the class and you're ready to start, okay, you go straight into the pair and then a quick bit of sharing. No materials needed. Group decision, problem solving. This goes back to people having a role. So rather than saying to students, if they've read, for example, they might have read about different places in the world, rather than saying, talk about the different places that you read about, we can say, okay, together, you all need to agree which of these places will you choose to go on holiday and why. So that's going to involve everybody, because you can't do it until everybody has agreed. An activity that I like to do a lot with larger groups is called Pass the Paper. So in their groups, whatever size groups you've decided upon, you give each group a piece of paper. And it's a kind of brainstorming activity. So you might get them to, if we continue this idea about food, write down, you have 1 minute in your group, how many food words can you think of? Put them on your paper. And we have a timer. Maybe it's 30 seconds, maybe it's 1 minute. Okay, stop. And then this group must pass their paper to this group. This group must pass their paper to this group, and so on and so forth. Okay, and start. My group gets the paper from the previous group, and we have to see if we can add anything. Okay, and each group uses a different pen color. At the end of the activity, the papers will have gone around all the groups, and they get their original paper back, and they see how many things have been added to their list. And perhaps they discuss in groups and in their group which ones they know and which ones they don't know. So again, it's not just working your group, but relating your group to the other groups in the class, so that everybody feels part of this large lesson, rather than a sort of tiny individual within 50. Okay, so we've talked about this, tasks which produce something. tend to work well in larger groups because of the need to have finished something by the end. You don't want your group to look like, oh, we haven't done anything. Jigsaw readings. So this is a kind of information gap activity. So again, if we want to create that communication, maybe I read this part of the text, you read that part of the text, and I can easily discuss my part of the text with my partner to find out what information he has that I don't have. You can give half the class one side and half the class the other. Role plays and simulations. Okay, so simulation is a role play basically, but maybe it's got a bit more background, and it's kind of can be a group role play. So typically we think of a role play as just being student A, student B. Okay, but particularly with slightly older learners, university learners, teenagers, we can give them more background information. So it might be something like your university it has some money to give to one of the societies. Okay, you're going to try and make sure that it's your society that gets the money. So me and my partner might have a little roll card telling us what our society is. The other group might have a different one. So we have to read our background information, and then we're going to complete the role play. But there are sort of 4 or 5 of us in that group role play. And project work. Things that go on from sort of lesson to lesson across a series of lessons works very well with the slightly larger groups, and with the idea that within that group people can have different roles, and then towards the end of the project they all need to come together to create this whole thing. Okay, so very quickly, top tips, and then we'll see if we can fit any questions in. Top tips. You may have more, but these are mine. Focus on the positives. Okay, nobody wants to be in a teaching situation where they feel like, oh no, I've got to teach this big group. So think about what can I do rather than what can't I do? Because we can do most things, we just may need to adapt them slightly. And when we do that, be realistic. There might be some things we can't do exactly as we would like to. So decide, no, that's not going to work. Fine, okay, think of something that will work. I think this is a really important point. We can't expect, if we haven't been doing this kind of work with a group of 50, or if they're a new group and they're not used to doing this kind of thing, for it immediately to work perfectly. So, give yourself time, practice it, tell the students that we're going to be doing this again. Don't worry, we're going to be doing this again. And repeat things, build up a bank of activities that your students know and understand how they work. This will reduce the stress in terms of classroom management. And then once they've got this thing and they know how to do it, and it doesn't take a lot of time for you to get them into it, the week after that you might introduce another activity, or the month after that a different activity, and build up their understanding of that. This is one of the biggest things I would say. Try not to have big chunks of your lesson where one student is talking and 49 students are listening. Okay. So, for example, if you've done a role play, it doesn't really help maintain enthusiasm and interaction if after they've done it with their partner, then we have to watch 5 different pairs do it in front of the class, because most of the students will realise, okay, I'm not involved in this part. So keep those whole class activities shorter and extend the pair and the group activities. We've talked about this, use routines, but change the interaction so they don't get bored. and give tasks with a purpose. Those are my top tips. So we are up to our hour, but I do see that we had a couple of questions come up. So just to quickly look at those. Kitty was talking about being encouraged with differentiation to make 2 or 3 different lesson plans for each level of students within the class. That is very challenging, yes. I guess it would depend on your teaching context, whether you're able to do that, whether you have the time to do that, and how much work it would take with a class of 50 to do that. I think, for me, I think a lot of the time we don't have to have 3 completely different tasks, particularly if we're talking about the communicative bits. We might not have to design totally different things, but we might give the students 3 ideas to choose from. Like I've said, like, okay, do you want to do a presentation? Now that allows those who are confident, more accurate speakers to get into that and do that. Or would you like to write a summary, okay? Or a review of the text that you've written. So I think there are ways to provide variety and choice that will allow students to work at their own level of challenge. Okay, I think we are just about out of time. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I hope that you have found some techniques, some interesting things that you can take away and apply, perhaps one by one, if you're teaching large classes. And my advice is just be brave, try it, and be nice to yourself. Don't expect it all to go perfectly the first time you do it, okay? But the more communicative it is, the more likely you are to keep more of that big number of students engaged and learning. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. I will say goodbye for now. We will be having another RELO webinar in December, so please do keep looking at the RELO Bangkok Facebook page and the AUA Professional Learning Facebook page, and we will message you all to let you know what exciting topic we have for you next. Thank you very much, and thanks again to the US Department of State. See you soon. Bye.